Hello everyone and welcome to another Middlegame episode focusing on the pawn structure with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. In this episode, we will focus on another weak pawn, which is the backward pawn. A backward pawn is a pawn that cannot advance with the support of a friendly pawn or a protected one. Although it isn't physically prevented from moving, it can't advance because it would be captured by an enemy pawn. Its inability to move safely makes it a weakness and a target for attack. In this first example, black's pawn on b6 is a backward pawn. If you were to move to b5, it would simply be taken by the pawn on c4. In this next example, black has a backward pawn on d6 and on b7. Now, the pawn on d6 is a great weakness because it's on an open file. The pawn on b7, it's not necessarily a big weakness since it's not on an open file. However, the hole it has on b6 can be a weakness. We will explore weak squares later on in our pawn structure series. In this video, I want to give you some general rules that you can follow in fighting against the backward pawn, and I will also show you some tactical elements and strategies that can be applied in these type of games. In the second part of this lesson, we will look at some Grandmaster games to see how they apply these strategies in their games. So let's get started. The first rule is that you want to trade the minor pieces when your opponent has a backward pawn. Another rule is that you want to place a piece in front of a backward pawn so it can't move forward. Also, as with an isolated pawn, keeping the queens on the board when facing a backward pawn tends to make the defense more difficult. Applying these rules can create the opportunity for some great tactics that can give you a winning advantage. So let's take a look at some of those positions. In this position, black has a backward pawn on d6, and here with white to move, he can go up a pawn. After rook takes e5, if black captures the rook with d takes e5, then the white rook on d1 will capture the rook on d7, and now white is up a pawn. And coming back after rook takes e5, if black here doesn't capture the rook, he plays something like king to f7. Well, after rook to e5, white has a winning advantage, keeping pressure on the isolated pawn now. If black continues with something like king to f6, well, here white can play pawn to e5 check. After king to e6, white will trade the rooks and the pawn for a winning pawn endgame. I'm going to just fast forward through the end of the game so you can see how white can win this game. And here white is winning. And coming back after the rook retreats back to d5, even if black here plays different, instead of moving the king to f6, even if he plays king to e6 here, black is also losing. After e5, black cannot capture the pawn on e5 as he's going to lose the rook. And coming back, if he just makes a waiting move, maybe rook to a6, white will convert into a winning pawn endgame just as we've seen in the previous position. And here we reach the exact same position as before. In this next example, after white captures the bishop on e7 and the rook captures back, the backward pawn will fall, and now white has a winning advantage, especially taking control of the open file. In this next example, black's backward pawn on d6 is under tremendous pressure. Even though there are minors on the board, white is totally winning. Right now, white attacks the pawn on d6 with 5 total pieces, 2 rooks and the queen, the bishop and the knight, and black defends also 5 times with the 2 rooks, bishop, knight, and queen. However, after e5, white is totally winning. Here, if black plays f takes e5, well, white can now capture back with the bishop, and if black does capture the bishop back, his rook on d7 is now only defended by the queen and the other rook, while white is attacking it 3 times with the 2 rooks and the queen. So he's going to be able to take the rook on d7. After rook takes d7 and rook takes d7, black cannot capture back and white is up material with the winning game. Coming back, here even if black doesn't take the bishop, he's totally losing. The pawn on g5 is a big weakness. The queen can capture it, attacking the king, and he should definitely win this game. When fighting against the backward pawn, you want to make sure that that pawn remains backward, or you're going to lose your advantage. In this position, it would be a terrible mistake if white moved the knight on d5 right away, because after the bishop takes the knight and e takes d5, that backward pawn is not on an open file anymore, and white just lost his advantage. Coming back, a much better move here will be rook f to d1, taking control of the square in front of that backward pawn. After that, if black responds with rook f to d8, now we can move the knight to the d5, because after bishop takes d5, we will be able to capture back with the rook, maintaining a backward pawn and also an advantage. So always make sure to capture back with another piece, not a pawn, so you could keep your advantage. Two possible continuations here could be rook a to c8, after that rook a to d1, and if here black defends the pawn with rook to c6, well, white here can use the strategy that we've seen before where rook takes e5, winning a pawn and also gaining an advantage. And coming back, another try that black can have is pawn to f6. After rook a to d1, let's say king to f7, c5. Here, obviously, black cannot take the pawn as he's going to lose a rook behind, and white will be up a piece and winning the game. And if he doesn't capture the pawn, if he moves something like king to e6, after rook takes d6 check, rook takes d6 and rook takes d6, the king will have to move back, and here white has a much better game. He's up a pawn, he has control of the open file. After he moves the king to f2 and starts marching up the board, he should definitely be able to win this game. In this next position, white just captured the knight on c6, and black has to capture back. If he captures back with the rook, this will be a terrible mistake, because now black has a backward pawn on d6, and white has an advantage. However, coming back, black can respond here with b takes on c6. This is the best move. Now the knight will have to move away, and black does not have a backward pawn anymore. After knight to c3, black could continue with something like d5. After e takes d5, c takes d5, and now a fork is threatened on d4. So after something like knight to a4 and d4, black here has a winning advantage. Another way of preventing a weak backward pawn can be done sometimes by exchanging the pawn that prevents it from moving. So here with black to move, f5 is an excellent move. Here, if white captures on f5, let's say with e takes f5, after the bishop captures back, he's hitting the rook on a1, and if that rook moves away, now the pawn on b2 will fall. And coming back, even if white here tries knight to d5, after bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, rook takes e4, black is up a pawn with the winning advantage. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for the second part where I'm going to go over some Grandmaster games to see how they use these strategies in their game. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.